We have a really good afternoon with lots of involvement from you and some great panels coming. But we wanted to frame all that and get ourselves going by talking about this idea of the building of partnerships. Exactly how do we do it? We have people at each of the tables who are from different worlds entirely. And I'm sure part of the time they're wondering how on earth they're going to bridge things. The SVX is a good example of this because indeed in the SVX example, what we're really talking about is, I guess, a bit of a dating game between ideas and money. And the SVX is going to be an opportunity for people to meet and decide for themselves whether they'd like to go out on a first date and maybe if it all works out, get married one day. So that's what the SVX will be in its full flower. Right now, I want to introduce somebody who as a youth believed she'd have a career in the arts, but after college, kind of got torn between art and social science and chose social science, never looking back. In 1991, after a successful career in the NGO sector, she joined the International Business Leaders Forum, backed by over 100 multinationals. It promotes responsible business, particularly in emerging economies. As director of IBLF's specialist program, the Partnering Initiative, she's developed a comprehensive approach to the art and science of cross-sector partnership for sustainable development, working in more than 25 countries with international corporations, the United Nations governments, and a wide range of civil society organizations. We're glad she could be with us here today. She's also the author of the Partnering Toolbook and the Brokering Guidebook. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Roz Tennyson.
Hello. I was daunted before I started, but hearing one's own biography sort of read out as an introduction is a little bit even more daunting. I was daunted by the film. I thought the film was just wonderful. And I'm extremely daunted by the august number of people and the level of engagement, the level of understanding of this topic of social entrepreneurship, social innovation. So I would like to start by saying thank you to the Minister. I think there's just one Minister left at the moment, but others will reappear, I have no doubt. To the organisers and to all of you, for those of you who invited me. It's a very interesting question as to why I'm here. I think I may be the only foreigner in the room because it's a very Ontario-wide initiative, and so I may be booed off as being not having a voice to add to the table in this very Ontario-wide initiative. I also almost always say no to conference speaking because I don't really like doing it very much. But for some reason I said yes, and I don't still know why I said yes, because as soon as I said yes, I kind of thought, why did I say yes? But actually we've had some wonderful exchanges in building up to this, and I knew as soon as I sat down this morning why I'd said yes. Because you don't know until you hear it, but actually there are fantastic overlaps, complementarities, and similarities between the way you are all talking about social innovation and the way that I would talk about partnership. And I think both have the risk of being misunderstood, being misrepresented. Perhaps partnership has been a word that's been in use longer than social innovation. And my worst fear is that partnership is used almost like sticking plaster to paper over the cracks, that people are not really giving the rigor and the vigor to understanding partnership that we actually need if partnerships are going to work. In fact, about 5 years ago, I was quite convinced that partnerships would become discredited and would no longer be available as a kind of mechanism for change. Given that I, at that point, spent 15 years working on it, it was a little bit of a depressing thought. But anyway, I'm going to kick off. So IBLF, International Business Leaders Forum, has been introduced. I won't spend any time on it, although the partnership bit of it is one subset. I think all the companies that Mr. Pigott mentioned this morning have been on our board at one time or another, with the exception of Walmart. So we are very familiar with the kind of issues that he was talking about. But I guess IBLF as a whole is really looking at why should business be engaged as part of the solution to sustainable development challenges. And the bit of the equation that I deal with is the how. And from 1900 onwards, which is when the organization was founded, we've really tried to specialize in the how of bringing business to the table alongside other sectors, aka partnership. My own background, as Ralph was hinting at, was probably even more bizarre and eccentric than he suggested, is that I did train in theatre studies. I've been involved in community development. I've been a university lecturer at Cambridge. I'm a trained coach and mentor. I studied Tai Chi for 12 years and taught it for 5. My last job was the CEO of a holistic medicine organisation. And then for some extraordinary reason, I was offered this job. And I was offered this job, and I tell this story because my parents for many years thought I had no career whatsoever, had no sense of direction, was really going to waste whatever talents I had. And then when I heard about this job or came to this job, I suddenly knew that I'd found what I didn't know I'd been looking for, if you know what I mean. And it started with me giving a major critique to the boss of the organisation. The organisation was 1 year old. I'd been to Rio de Janeiro as a community entrepreneur, invited to participate in a business leaders summit there. And I spent the whole plane journey back berating him with how inadequate the summit had been. He was very upset with me. And then I felt so guilty that I'd been so critical that I thought I'd better write him a nice letter. And the letter I wrote him said, you can't talk about partnership between business and NGOs, even if you have business and NGOs in the room, if they have absolutely no idea how to do it. So it's one thing to use the word, it's another thing to say, where the heck do you start? And the rest is kind of history, because he said, well, I don't know either, you better come and try. At which point I pointed out I'd never worked with business, never worked in international development, knew nothing about partnership, and this was probably a big mistake. And he said, well, nobody else has asked the questions, so you better come and try. And I partly tell that story because I think probably some of you in the audience might decide that I'm a social innovator. So although I've worked with an organisation for 20 years, it's been in the realm of trying to make things different and in a very, very challenging role in what seems to be a fairly conservative and conventional organisation. So what I would like to do is to introduce my remarks with an extract from a poem. The very clever amongst you might have linked my name to a poet. So I am descended from the poet, so I take every license. I'm not going to quote from him because I don't terribly like his poetry, but I'm going to quote from a poet because I think it's really nice to try and mix the medias a bit, and it's been great to have these very, very enlightening and enlivening films. So I'm going to read a poem which is from one of my favourite authors, who's a Nigerian author. It works. And this is a poem called Dancing with Change, and the author is Ben Okri. And it's just an extract. It's a wonderful, long, long, long poem. You can get it off the internet. It is natural to want serenity and flowering gardens of lovely symmetry and Virgil's spreading beaches and the lost happy times of the wise ones who were wise in the knowledge that the mind cannot comprehend all, but at least can smile at infinity. But the river flows, and so must we. Change is the happy God that Heraclitus saw in the golden river. Spread illumination through this darkening world. Spread illumination through this darkening world. No change is good, but dancing gracefully with change is better. Anybody know who Heraclitus was? So Heraclitus, I looked him up on Saturday, so I now know. He was the philosopher before Plato, sometime before Plato, who looked into a river and said, you can't step into the same river twice. So his whole philosophy was about change. And I think that's why Okri has picked him up as his image. And in a way, what I would like to suggest is that cross-sector partnership is a way of dancing gracefully with change at its best. So what do I mean by partnership? I think the title cross-sector partnership implies government working, so the public sector working with business, working with civil society. Of course, there's much more nuance to it than that. There's academia, there's media, there's many other layers. So that's a rather simplistic picture. And perhaps cross-sector suggests something, but perhaps we should talk more about multi-stakeholder. Perhaps that has a wider kind of remit. So although I might use the term cross-sector, I think in your imaginations you could think about multi-stakeholder. And I think the reason that people find this an attractive proposition is because they have to admit that no one sector has all the answers. I mean, I'm going to say a lot of things now that have been said this morning, so I hope that will not just be repetitive. I hope it'll look as if there really is a coming together of ideas here. So the first thing about it is that it really is almost like an admission that no one sector has the answers. Government does not have all the answers, business does not have all the answers, society does not have all the answers. It also seems to accept that you can't go it alone if you expect people to follow you. If you want people to come with you, you can't be isolationists. So, you have to open the door. I like that image of the doors opening layer by layer. And I think it also acknowledges and builds on what I would say was an essential human condition, which is that human beings are absolutely fundamentally interdependent. So although we tend to think of partnership as a new mechanism, it's in fact probably the oldest mechanism known to any of us. In other words, the societies that survive are the societies that learn how to collaborate, how to help each other, how to support each other, even in the darkest times. In fact, probably even more in the darkest times. So although partnership, I always think of conventional modern versions of partnership being born at the Rio Summit, which is 1992. So I think our organization was a couple of years ahead of that particular game. When I work in developing countries with very much community-based groups, they are completely comfortable with this. This is something they recognize completely. So I think we have to be clear that in a way it's as old as man and a very, very new challenge. So I think what we have to do is to think about what does the word partnership mean and be a little bit more precise about it. And it always surprises me how often people go into something called a partnership and don't actually take the trouble to define the word to each other. So I always try and suggest that people should go back to the dictionary definition, which is actually incredibly simple, but I think quite significant. There are two things in the dictionary definition that seem to me to be important. The first one is that it's an ongoing working relationship. In other words, it's not a quick fix, and it's something that happens over time. So I think that chimes with the slow approach that we were talking about this morning. And the second one is even more important, which is where risks and benefits are shared. If risks are dumped and benefits are in one direction, then I think it's not a partnership. And actually, if you don't measure by any other means, those two measures are quite useful. So I think we live in a world where a lot of people call things partnerships, which actually aren't. They are subcontracted work, or they're putting risk onto some other body or some other entity. So I think if you look into your partnerships that you have and ask yourself these two questions, it's quite a good measure as to how much of a partnership are they. Having said that, I don't think anybody has to conform to the English dictionary definition or to my definition. What I think does have to happen in a partnership is that partners around the table have to know that they share a definition. I'm constantly astonished how few partners ever discuss what they mean by the word. So it's not uncommon for when partnerships begin to unravel, and they do unravel quite often for reasons that we might come on to in a moment, to lay blame at each other, saying, well, this is a partnership and we expect it. And somebody else says, well, we know it's a partnership, but we thought. And suddenly you find that people have a quite different interpretation of what the word means. And we do have a very big use of the word. There's very commercial partnerships on the one end, sort of partnerships of professionals, partnerships of doctors and architects and so on the other. And then this rather new paradigm, which is a new kind of cross-sector collaboration. In fact, I've begun almost not to use the word partnership too much and tend to prefer the word collaboration, because partnership might just lead to kind of preconceptions. So partnership does mean something really quite specific, and I'll go on to explain this in a moment. But I think the most important thing about a partnership, even if it has a definition, is that partnerships should be constructed in such a way that they're really, really flexible. So a partnership isn't a way to fix things, or to fix things into one sort of model, but they're really ways to provide opportunities for diversity, for evolution over time, and to be responsive to the context. So partnership should be very close, I think, to the kind of models of social innovation that we were hearing this morning. So one of the first things to look at in a partnership is that it isn't simply a dating agency and then a marriage, take the marriage analogy, that actually there is a lot of life beyond the honeymoon period. And very often what I find is that people, first of all, rush into marriage too quickly, and then go on honeymoon and are in love with each other for a certain amount of time. This is not supposed to say anything about my views of marriage, but then come back from their honeymoon and have to get on with real life. And actually this moment after an agreement is signed is very often a very difficult and dangerous moment for partnerships. The point of this schema is not to say that any partnership ever works in this nice logical progression from point 1 to point 12, but that partnerships need as much attention to detail as any other form of interaction. And some people say this is quite close to a kind of project cycle, and maybe it is, maybe it isn't, depends on your project. But I think this actually does try and show that every bit of the partnership has a different focus, a different emphasis, and that actually different qualities and characteristics and skills that need to be brought to bear. So the first thing to notice about the cycle is that we suggest there are at least 4 phases before you sign anything. Many, many people sign an agreement, sign a partnership agreement, and then create the partnership. And I have to say that I think a lot of donors are to blame here, because I think donors have insisted so much that partnerships are the way to go forward. There are innumerable numbers of partnerships that have been created sort of artificially in order to get access to resources. And then when you start trying to implement those programs, you find the partnership actually falls apart. There isn't enough substance, there isn't enough content, there isn't enough understanding of who's going to do what and what the structures are. So I think I spend a lot of time talking to donors about this. So I think this scoping, identifying, building, planning, outline planning before you sign an agreement, rather than getting an agreement and then having to work all that out and retrofit it, is quite important. The next point to make about this slide is that what agreement you have is also quite important, and you may have many models of agreement that enshrine what I'm about to describe. But again, there are many places where you have a very open-ended partnership discussion, and when it comes to signing an agreement, you battle with the lawyers and you end up with a contract. And then actually a contract very rarely enshrines the values or the philosophy or the ambition of a partnership. It usually does exactly what we're trying not to do, which is to allocate responsibilities to one or other party and alleviate the blame or alleviate the responsibilities of a third party. So contracts tend to be, this is what you will do, and we will monitor it, and this is how you will spend the resources, and we will make sure you spend them legitimately, as opposed to an agreement which should be enshrining what brings you together, what your objectives are, what the complementarity is about what you do, what you believe partnership to be, what you see the potential of this relationship to be, and so on. So we argue quite strongly for what we might call an umbrella agreement or a collaboration agreement that doesn't necessarily deal with money, but deals with the point of the relationship. And that becomes a very useful thing that you can keep going back to when issues of resources or issues of governance or whatever come back. So you've enshrined something in a much bigger umbrella agreement, and then you could have subcontracts for different pieces of work if that's necessary. The next phase is quite a long phase. The next two phases really are obviously a cycle in their own right. So the managing and maintaining phase, where you are really trying to mobilize the resources that have been committed. And by resources, I mean every possible kind of resource. So one of the great things about partnership is that you move away from a definition of money as the only possible resource. In fact, you build a partnership out of diversity of resources, with everybody bringing something different to the table, some of which may be money, some of which may be instead of money, and some of which may be nothing to do with money, but all of which has value, and without any of which you wouldn't be able to proceed. So the whole concept of resourcing is something that needs really quite a lot more thinking. So you have a managing and maintaining phase, and I'm talking here about managing and maintaining the partnership, not simply focusing on delivering a project. I'll come back to that in a moment. And then reviewing and revising. It astonishes me again how often partnerships are not reviewed. People will assess impacts, they look at what has been delivered, they look at deliverables, but they won't necessarily go back to the partnership and say, did this achieve what our goals were? Have we found value in working together? Do we have other ideas of what we might do differently? Maybe some of your partnerships do that because you're in a social innovation space, but many partnerships that I see don't do that. And then somewhere in the partnering cycle, the open question about what happens next. How do we move on? What opportunities are there for doing more of the same, scaling up, working together to do something different, or moving away from each other and accepting we've done whatever we've done, and we're now going off to do different things. Of course, I say no partnership model that really follows the schema quite so simply. But I also want to isolate or highlight one point that I think is really critical to partnership. And for me, it was an aha moment about 12 years ago now, which is where I think there's a real use in distinguishing between the partnership as a set of activities, so in other words, the projects and the activities the partnership undertakes, and the partnership as a process that is based on relationships. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that most people in partnership spend most of their time thinking about what are we doing, and have we achieved our goal, and have we delivered this particular piece of work? Have we alleviated poverty in this district? Have we provided this housing, or whatever the focus of the project is? So as soon as the agreement is signed, almost all focus goes on to the deliverables. But I think what is interesting to me about partnership, and where I think it might overlap very well with social innovation in many other ways as well, is that the partnership process is something that really needs attention in its own right. So just because you have an agreement doesn't mean you now know how to work together. It may be something you have to continuously work at for reasons I'll come on to. So the aha moment for me was that at some point early on in my organisation, I was asked to take a model of partnership that happened in the UK and take it to India. And I spent 1 minute in India and realised this is complete and utter nonsense. And the Indians did not need my model of partnership from the UK, and I didn't have the gall to even pretend for 5 minutes that they did. So in other words, every partnership that is ever created, I think, is unique. And I think that's incredibly exciting. So every single partnership program, partnership initiative, partnership activity is right for its particular context, for its particular group of people who are around the table. So you can, everybody who grows a partnership can be duly proud that no other partnership is like it. And I think that's very exciting in a very homogenized, globalized world. But what the real aha moment was discovering quite by chance really, was that the process of partnering is truly universal. So what I've spent my last 20 years pretty much doing is trying to distill what is the process of partnering that can be shared across cultures, across countries, within sectors, across sectors, within nations, and so on and so forth. So I think one can hold on to that idea. There's something both very empowering and exciting about each partnership being unique, and something incredibly pleasing. There is a global phenomenon that actually adds value worldwide, as opposed to many global phenomena that actually, I mean, there are many others, but there are some that actually don't seem to add value, that seem to actually dehumanize rather than humanize. So just moving on to think about, are there some key principles in partnership? And I was interested that several of the speakers this morning did talk about principles. And I should say that every bit of information I share with you about partnership has got nothing to do with being an academic or being clever or thinking all this out. This is all just based on observation. When I first went to my first assignment in this job, I literally went in, as I explained already, with very little appropriate experience, very little schooling in the topic, and also with what I would call an empty suitcase. So I didn't have any tricks or tools or anything. All I could do was to go into any new situation and ask as many questions as I could and begin to formulate with the group I was working with what might be the partnership response to that particular situation. But what happened again and again and again, no matter where I was in the world, whether it was the World Bank 1 minute or a small community project in Vietnam or South Africa or whatever, these core principles came back again and again and again just by asking the question. Okay, if you are going to partner with government or with business or with civil society, what would you need to have in place to be able to do this partnership without feeling coerced, co-opted, to use a phrase from this morning? And time and again, the answer would come back, we need equity. In other words, if we're a small NGO or we're a small unit and we're going to be asked to be working with these people who have much more power, much more authority, much more resource than we do, we really want to know that we're going to be given respect, that we're going to be treated fairly. Otherwise, we really don't want to be at the table. So something about equity is fundamental. Something about transparency. We don't want people to smile at us and we don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We really want to know if there are hidden agendas. You know, if we really want to know what people's agendas are. There may be agendas we can live with, but we really can't live with something we don't understand or we don't know. So something about really being committed to being transparent, being honest, being open. Because only then will you build enough trust. And people did talk about trust this morning, but I think the reference to trust talked about, I think it was a gentleman sitting in the far chair there, who talked about 4 days of trust building before they had the conversation that said, what next? So I think you can't jump into trust, you have to earn trust, and you partly earn trust by operating with each other in as open and transparent a way as you can. And if you trust each other, then you're going to be much more willing to take risks. But you can't demand trust, you have to earn it. And then the third one is something about mutuality. So we've already heard about risks and benefits being shared, but this is much more about it is legitimate to get benefit from this partner relationship. So I think only if partners feel they're benefiting, whatever that means, I use the word benefit purposefully, only if partners feel they're benefiting from the relationship will they stay at the table. If they feel they come to meeting after meeting or workshop after workshop and they cannot see the point from their own values and their own organization's interests, then they simply won't stay. So mutual benefit is incredibly important to engagement. Now, it might be terribly simplistic, but you could actually attach a sector to each of those principles. And this is making it too simple. I know it's more complicated than that. But generally speaking, when you ask a question about what principles do you think will work, it's usually the public sector who have a lot to say about equity. They feel quite strongly that their remit and democratic situation is to make sure that everybody's at the table, everybody has access, and so on. I think it's civil society who talk a lot about transparency, who really fight for honesty, openness, exposing bad practice, and so on and so forth. And I think for companies to be at the table, they do need to feel that they get a return. And too many companies go into partnerships feeling they can't talk about profit or sustainable business because they feel somehow they'll be marginalized or they won't be accepted. But that is what makes a company work. So you have to be able to say, we must go away from here with our company stronger, and so on and so forth. So to operate with these principles needs quite a shift of what we might call behavior. And I think quite a lot of what is involved in partnering involves really what we might call cultivating and changing and challenging behavior and developing good partnering behavior. So to summarise this, could talk for ages about skills. We do an awful lot of skills training for partnership, but I've got 2 slides here. One about art. So I think partnering is an art because it needs all these things. I think most of you will recognise this. We talked about innovation non-stop all morning. So I think partnerships need imagination, they need insight, they need feeling, they need to be emotionally attached. They need to be able to see a vision of the future, so you need to be able to look at an egg and have some idea of the bird that's going to come. Not prefix it, but just know that in this tiny egg there is this potential. Very much what people have been saying about innovation. Above everything in partnership, you need people skills. It is absolutely more than anything about relationships and relationship building. And probably the single most important skill is active listening. And all of us are guilty of feeling very strongly about what we do and rushing in and telling everybody and not really listening, not really being patient enough to hear somebody else's point of view. And a partnership only really works when you ask more questions than you answer, or than you listen to the sound of your own voice. And there is something about being dedicated and a level of personal engagement. I think as social entrepreneurs, social innovators, you would understand that completely. So it's a very creative act at its best. It's a very challenging, and I think it is out of the box, and I think it is visionary, and it takes courage. But the other side of the coin is that I think partnering is also a science, because as well as insight, imagination, and feeling, you also need analytical skills, knowledge, clear thinking, as well as a vision of the future. You need to know what you're building on. You can't impose a partnership in a war-torn society that hasn't yet mediated and hasn't yet overcome the challenges and difficulties. Partnership isn't a panacea. There will be a time when a partnership approach is right and a time when it's premature. As well as people skills, you do need administrative and technical skills. This is kind of pretty obvious stuff, but it is a kind of dance. I like this image of a dance between the two. And as well as personal engagement, as well as active listening, you also need to be very precise in the way you speak. So we have to change the way we talk to each other, because we all talk in jargon. Each sector has its own jargon. Each sector has its own kind of language, and it's really impenetrable sometimes. So sometimes the conversations we have are alienating rather than engaging. And as well as personal engagement, we also need to cultivate a kind of professional detachment. What needs to happen now, not what do I want, what needs to happen now for this to work. We actually spend a lot of time working with individuals and building individual competencies. But we also spend quite a bit more time now working with organizations, because I think somebody said this morning that actually sometimes it's more difficult internally to get buy-in from your organization than it is to bridge the boundary externally. I think that's absolutely true in partnership as well, that people make an effort to go outside the door and to really respond and work with each other, and then they get quite shocked when they get back into their organization and realize they have an enormous internal sales job to do. And it isn't just a question of individuals, but of systems. And it isn't just a question of systems, but it's a question of fixed mindsets and assumptions. I think that the assumptions we all make all the time are very, very difficult, and we don't challenge our own assumptions enough. And just to give you one example, it took 25 emails to establish that ministers, not ministers in Canada, I should add, but ministers actually in a country in South Asia, which shall be nameless, and heads of international agencies who were supposed to be partnering to implement the Paris Declaration, and all the aid was supposed to be working through a partnership model. It took 25 emails to persuade them for a one-day workshop they should have round tables and not 2 long lines. And every single time they'd met, they'd had the ministers on one side and the aid agencies on the other. And it really did take 25 emails. And at some point, somebody said, but this is completely breaking culture. And I said, but you're inviting us to come and change the rules of the game. And if you can't even decide that sitting at different tables, where are you going to start changing the mindsets? So there are a number of issues in partnering. One is about how do you deal with the actual or perceived power imbalance. So it may be an actual power imbalance, or it may simply be a perceived power imbalance based on assumptions. And this is quite a fun slide. Didn't laugh as much as people usually laugh, but you're doing well over there. But this is an interesting slide because it depends where you show it as to who anybody thinks the big person is. So pre the economic meltdown, if I showed this anywhere in North America, people would have said Coca-Cola was the big guy. If I'd shown it in post-communist Russia, they'd have said it was government. Whenever I've shown it in Bangladesh, and I've shown it 3 times, they said it's civil society, and it's true. Civil society is overwhelmingly dominating in Bangladesh society because it's so well funded and has such a presence, has such a reputation. It's not to decry it in any way, but it is an imbalance. And if you show it in the former Yugoslavia, they would say it's the United Nations. And so it is interesting that culturally, contextually, it might be quite different, quite unexpected. But also within a partnership, it might be quite unexpected. And if I understood the speaker this morning right, the implication was that Walmart and Coca-Cola and P&G, who one might think of as being the big guys, were in fact the small guys because they were under pressure from the big guys, which is basically the consumer. So I think the power balance may not be quite as obvious as we think. And when I was in Ghana about 4 weeks ago and was running a workshop for a mining company, local authority in a rural area, and tribal chiefs, it was really interesting when this once went up because the mining company looked very uncomfortable and the tribal chief, one of the tribal chiefs, roared with laughter. And he said through a translator, well, you might think you're the big guy, but we can stop you having access to land. And so the power imbalance in a partnership is not always what it seems. I think a second thing is, the most important thing is trying to get beneath the skin of each other's sectoral values or behaviors. So this idea of trying to understand each other's underlying interests. You build up a partnership out of meeting each other's underlying interests, not their positions. And I could spend a long time talking about the difference between positions and underlying interests. So in other words, an early stage, that early period of a partnership cycle really has to be to get under the skin of what is motivating, what is driving. And a very interesting question, because again, somebody on the platform this morning said something about look at who you partner with. I thought the implication was try and partner with people you know you're going to get on with. Maybe that's wrong. But my recommendation is that you look to partner with people you don't expect to get on with and find out what they bring that you might really not have understood, not know. So for me, partnership is a fantastic opportunity to break the rules of the game, to get outside your own box, to get beyond your own assumptions, and to really go into a meeting not selling your idea, but actually genuinely wanting to know what somebody else's idea is. It's quite a change of culture. We're all very used to thinking we know best, just the same as everybody else, but just training yourself to really be genuinely interested in somebody else with a completely different perspective might reveal something that you had no idea about, and out of that, you'll forge a partnership that has enormous value. And as I've suggested before, I think there's a huge amount to be gained from investing in the partnership building process. So for the last 8 years, we've been running a project to develop a new professional discipline called partnership brokering. Who is it that actually puts the glue together to bring people together, either officially, unofficially, internally to the partnership, externally to the partnership? But so the people we would characterize as partnership brokers or intermediaries or partnership process managers, whatever word you'd like to use, have to bring to the table quite a medley of competencies or approaches. So on the one hand, they have to be businesslike. You can't have partnerships being loose and woolly and badly managed. People won't stay. You need to have immaculate records, and different people, different sectors want different things from their records. So some sectors will want the minutes of the meeting with every single decision 40 pages long. Somebody else might want 5 bullet points that tells them what they've got to do before next week. These are completely different kinds of records. So you need to be very imaginative, very responsive to have a record keeper that can give you the records that each party wants, or come up with an agreed form of records that suits the partnership as a whole. A lot of partnering is about teaching or education, changing mindsets, changing assumptions. We talked about that. Some aspect of partnership might be about healing, that we decide we don't like whole sectors, and then we suddenly get to meet them and we realize, oh, maybe we have more in common. Maybe you have to make good. Maybe in some situations you have really bad experiences and negative experiences that have to be healed. And I don't know anybody who hasn't tried desperately to make a partnership work who hasn't felt like a parent, and who really, that whole idea of having to nurture something through its infancy, through its growing up, through its teenage tantrums, to what you hope for, which will be really good independence, sort of solid independence, is really important. And of course, some partnerships need monitoring. We talked about co-opting earlier, perhaps colluding. Perhaps sometimes you might go into a partnership and the people around the table might change and it might be taken off in a direction. So partnerships need to have a kind of a lens on them quite regularly. So this is just looking at partnering costs and benefits. And if I gave you 3 minutes, you'd have to work out what this equation meant, but we don't have 3 minutes, so I won't. What it basically means is that we can be very positivistic about partnership, but we also need to be realistic. And I think the term here is added value. It's only worth doing a partnership if you really can see that it's going to add significant value. And that's because when we're boasting and talking up partnerships, we think it's all about opportunities, better outcomes, and added quality of solution, all sorts of ancillary benefits. Those are all the things that we can say, yes, that's on the positive side of the scale. But sometimes we forget to take off the resources contributed and the other transaction costs. Partnerships can be quite expensive transactionally, either in terms of time, if you don't have a good system, good process to make them work effectively and efficiently, or in terms of simply just leaching and bleeding out resources that should be spent on the project in hand. And of course, you have to admit that there would always have been something else would have happened if you hadn't had the partnership. So a colleague of mine developed this for our brokering training, and I think it's quite a good way of saying, let's be critical about partnership, let's really be honest about the transaction costs they take, and really demand a lot of them so that we get a lot of value in return. And value can mean many different things. Value can mean we deliver the project we wanted to do. Value can mean we as individual partners got all sorts of benefits we didn't expect. We learned a lot. We understood different things. We got much more technical input. We met people we never thought we'd meet. We stood on platforms we never thought we'd stand on. There can be many, many benefits to the partners that are over and above the deliverable. And of course, ultimately, any partnership, whether it's tiny, local, or huge and global, can have some serious influence and some serious impact on policy and on changing the rules of the game, which is ultimately, I think, what all of us in this room are interested in doing. So to give you time to have some questions, just a few more additional challenges to bring to the table. These are really conundrums about partnerships. So what is leadership in a collaborative mechanism? So one of the things that stops partnerships working is when people say we can't make a decision until we've asked everybody, and we can't ask everybody until we have a meeting, and we can't have a meeting because everybody's too busy. So you have this kind of awful impasse where you just don't get to decision making because nobody quite knows how to take decisions or how to lead in a collaborative mechanism. When we train partnership brokers, we play an interesting game called the chairs game, and the point of the chairs game is that a walker walks to an empty chair and all the other people are sitting on chairs, and they have to stop the walker by sitting on the empty chair. And it's an exercise in what is the balance between collaboration and leadership. And every single group that ever plays the game can take anything from 10 minutes to 1.5 hours to get there, but they all go through the same pattern of imposing a strategy, telling each other what to do. Somebody becomes very bossy, somebody gets very offended, somebody walks out in a half, somebody gets hurt because they all rush together. It goes through the same pattern every time. And only with any luck, do you get to the point where you realize that the only way to fill the chair is by everybody sitting in their place and not rushing around, all knocking each other over, but waiting until the time is right for them to move, being the only obvious person to move into that empty chair. In other words, it is about immense attentiveness and knowing when it is your turn to lead. It's like passing the baton between different players. So it's not one person's job lead, it's everybody's job to lead. And I think that's fascinating, interesting thing about new models of leadership. So I think partnership can throw up, as I think social innovation can throw up, new models of leadership. Second thing, I've talked about reconfiguring language and thinking. I won't mention that again. Something about unity and diversity. So how much do you want it to work because you all speak the same language or you all understand each other well, or how much do you take the risk of having very, very divergent views at the table? And I think it is mostly divergency or diversity that actually brings innovation. So the best partnerships are those that feel courageous enough to take some risks, and again, that chimes with what was said this morning. Talked a little bit about views of success, and there's a big one, which is about, can any of us ever let go of control? And it's very tempting to think it's always the government who have to control everything, and I have to say worldwide it is the government who seems to creak to find it most difficult to give up that sense of having to control. But actually, NGOs don't like giving up control either. They kind of like to think they have the moral high ground, and they like to think that they want other people to join their crusade rather than giving away something, and so on and so forth. So what does it mean? How does one gracefully and graciously give up some level of control in order that the whole can work much better? Communication is a huge thing. And finally, something not on the list is accountability. People mentioned accountability this morning as being very restrictive. I think there's another dynamic for accountability in a partnership, which is that people have two levels of accountability. So anybody sitting at the table is accountable to their own system because they have their own line manager and their own system within their work. But increasingly in a partnership, they have to be co-accountable. If you co-create, you also have co-responsibility and you have co-accountability. And many partnerships have to work that through. At what point do you have to stick by your organization's interests and your job? And at what point do you have to persuade your organization that they have to let you be a little looser in your relationship because you have to be responsible to each other? I think this is a really big one that people haven't really spent enough time on. At its best, partnering for social change allows a level of risk-taking. I say this in all awareness that when I was giving I was working with a colleague and introducing somebody quite senior from somewhere, I can't remember who it was now, as to what partnership was. And he happened to speak before I did. And when the person said to him, and why do you think partnership is so important? He said without a blink, because it mitigates risk. And I was completely gobsmacked, because I would have said exactly the opposite. So I was then in this very difficult position of having to be the next one to speak and not contradict my colleague. But for me, I think a lot of people use the partnership word to mitigate risk. And I think we should all use the partnership word to say only by working collaboratively can we be bold enough, courageous enough, confident enough to take risks. So I would strongly urge the taking risk bit of this. At its best, partnering can mobilize diverse resources, and I haven't spent as much time as I could on that, but a partnership that uses less money and more of lots of other things is a much stronger partnership than one that is very, very, very dependent on money. I'm not talking about these capital investment projects, but the kinds of partnerships, I think the, I can't remember what it's called, Camden 10 something, thank you. So that description of creating space, of seeing what happened, of a door opening, another door opening, another door opening. I mean, I'm sure they needed money, I'm sure they got money to do what they had to do, but it wasn't a money-dependent model. I think it was something else. And I think the partnerships that can build out of, you can almost build a partnership out of the resources that are brought to the table, rather than have an idea for a project and then scrabble around trying to find the resources. So it might be better to think about what partnership do we want to have that would be really interesting, that would challenge us, that would bring new things to birth, and then how we, between us, contribute the resources or find the resources to make it work. I think, as I've suggested, that partnership gets beyond the status quo. It isn't a papering over the cracks. It isn't a collusion with the status quo. At its best, it's challenging the status quo, changing the rules of the game. Draws out new forms of leadership. Makes collaboration an exciting phenomenon rather than a dull one. I mean, that you can't wait to get to the meetings because you don't know what's going to happen next. Tackles the seemingly impossible and assumes that change is actually the norm. So I think everything that people have said about change this morning applies equally to partnership. You don't expect a partnership to fix things, you expect a partnership to be a mechanism for change. And that takes us straight back to Ben Ockery, because something else that Ben Ockery said is, as human beings, we are blessed with the necessity of transformation. And I think that applies to social innovation and to partnership. I've had to race through a lot of material, and I want to give you time to ask questions, which I'll do my best to answer, even more like to have conversations. But just if you want to know more about any of this stuff, we do have a whole sequence of toolbooks. They're all available for download for free. The partnership brokering project that I talked about, which is the thing that I'm currently working most on, there's a lot of information about partnership brokering. There's lots of materials about brokering. There's a book about brokering. There's trainings, there's courses, there's advice on how you can broker better. And then if you want to connect with other, what I call partnership practitioners, there's a forum where you can just sign up and join in. That's it.
Thank you, Roz. We want to take some questions, and we are going to be talking about the tools that we need for partnership, not as well, and the kinds of things that you think at the tables would really make a difference in moving things forward. But we'll do that in a few minutes. Right now, let's take our first question. Where shall it be?
I'm really happy to have comments as well as questions or disagreements.
There. All right. Please stand and identify.
Hi, Roz. I'm Cheryl Rose. I'm part of the SiG National Collaborative here in Canada, and our work is at the University of Waterloo. I really enjoyed your presentation. We've been thinking a lot about collaboration, relationships, partnerships, and we're about to launch this graduate diploma in social innovation. One of the key characteristics of this piece of education for us is that we're very intentionally recruiting across sectors so that we've got very diverse teams coming in together to learn together, to plan together, to design strategies, and to act together. And it's one of the most exciting parts of the program, and it's one of the riskiest parts of the program, because those that we speak to, and even in our own planning processes, that's the part we know could either be wonderful or disastrous. I couldn't agree with you more when you say that this collaboration piece, this relationship piece, is absolutely fundamental and key. But it's, you know, it's hard work. We can't take it for granted, and I think your project kind of speaks to that. It gives attention where I think attention is really needed. I wanted to ask you a question that kind of gets to something that when we had the three ministers up at the front and they were talking about their collaboration on this event here today, Glenn, I think it was, when he was asked, why did you partner with these particular ministries? And he said, well, I partnered specifically with Eric and Lauren. So he was talking about this individual connections.
Yes.
And we've been doing a lot of work recently, specifically on partnerships between universities and their communities. And when I talk to people in those kind of relationships, you know, the people that are deeply engaged in the partnerships will say, I don't partner with the university, I partner with Rick. I don't partner with, you know, the Food Bank of Toronto, I partner with Bill.
Sure.
So there's this real individual element to it all. But we talk about the sectors and we talk about organizations and institutions and corporations. So I just wondered if you might speak to that in your own work, if you've noticed that relationship there is between the individual that's engaged and then those that they're kind of representing or the world they're coming from.
Okay, thank you very much. Two comments really. The first one is about your course and about the challenges of building that cross-sector ability to work together. The bit about brokering that I would spend much longer on if I had time is that I truly believe that if you don't broker, if somebody, and it could be somebody spontaneously taking on that role, but if that person isn't there, the partnership will take forever to get going. So although it might look as if it's an upfront investment, it's actually a very, very cost-effective mechanism. So I think, and I do like slow, I totally buy the slow bit, but I think it doesn't have to be slow. I think it can be tightened up by professional management of the process. So if you can teach that in that social innovation course, you know, that's what you're looking at, is that actually you can do, I did one presentation in South Africa just around the time of the change of apartheid, and I'd written a book, and somebody said, well, introduced me by saying it's a really great book, but it seems to imply that what took us 2 years could have been done in 5 minutes. And so I did the workshop, and then at the end, the guy said, actually, what I realized is it could have been done in 3 months, and that's it. So it's not a minute, but it isn't 2 years. And that bit of process management is absolutely critical. And I came to that understanding because I did a lot of case studies of partnership. People kept telling me these great stories. And then I kind of say, well, hang on, how did you get to the great story? And almost inevitably, if you ask enough questions, somebody would say, well, without so-and-so, this is playing to your individual point, it wouldn't have happened. And then I kind of say, well, can't you put the so-and-so story into the story? Because if you don't put the so-and-so bit into the story, you're giving a very false impression that somehow this happens by magic, and it doesn't happen by magic. It takes a lot of hard work, usually from 1 or 2 or 3 people. So I think this brokering piece, the people who have the sleepless nights about whether the partnership is working or not, is really, really critical. And the more people can teach that, the more it'll become professionalized, and the more that will speed up and make much more solid the partnerships we have. That takes you into the reliance on individuals, and I think it's absolutely right that individuals are at the forefront. You can't take a risk as an organisation. Well, you can. You can't really take a risk as an organisation. It's usually the leader of the organisation, or it's somebody with enough courage or confidence in the organisation who will step outside the box. So I think the individuals really matter, but that's the story of the chairs game, which means that at the moment it's your turn to fill that chair, then you get up and you fill the chair. And then you sit on that chair for as long as it takes until it's next your turn to fill the chair. So there's a very fine balance between leadership, which says, I know best and I'm the boss, and individuality that says, this is all down to me, aren't I clever, or whatever it is, and a kind of, I will lead when the time is right, and I will allow you to lead because I know that you're the best person to lead at this moment. So there's kind of this cultivation of passing the baton, which is about leadership, but it's about ego-free leadership. It's a kind of non-egotistical leadership. And people, when they see it work, when people play the chairs game and it suddenly works, they get it completely. I still have people 15 years later saying, I learnt more from that game than I've ever learnt from any training. So this idea that you have to know where your individuality stops and your responsibility to let other people be individual begin. Of course, partnerships will start with individuals, but if they depend on individuals beyond a certain amount of time, and I don't know what that certain amount of time is, because it depends on the scale of the partnership, then they become very weak partnerships. Because if individuals take too much of a part, eventually other people will not take a part. What you really want is everybody to take responsibility, not 1 or 2 people. And the big test is whether you can take it back into your organisation and find the others who understand it well enough, who can replace you and stand in for you. And if you're one of those people upon whom it depends, then you have to set up strategies for consciously handing over to other people and giving other people the job. And the most creative strategy is to be unexpectedly absent without warning so that somebody else has to step into your shoes. So it's a great responsibility. It's a wonderful role to start something, but it's incredibly important that you know when to stand back and to see that its success depends on you standing back, not on you keeping going.
Good. I would like to reinforce that communications point about jargon. it seems incredibly alienating. And everyone has their own code and their own format, and we enter these things. And about last September, I started working with government for the first time. And the first meeting I sat in, I was just dumbfounded by the amount of acronyms I'd heard in 15 minutes. It must have been, without exaggeration, 25 different acronyms. Not one person slowed down to even bother telling me what one of them was. And now I sit in those meetings and I can speak acronym, but I don't know if the person who came into the meeting after me can, because it's really alienating, that use of so-called specific tribal language really can break things up.
Can I make one more comment about language? I know we need to move on, which is that one point is jargon. Another point is actually choosing. I talked about precise speaking. It's about choosing your words carefully. So I have a whole list of words that can be either partnership alienating or partnership engendering. So one such word is the word profit. So profit applies to one of the parties at the partnership, possibly. That's really matters to them. If you look up the word profit in the dictionary, I love the dictionary, it says the word profit means benefit. If you use the word benefit, everybody can get into the conversation. It's not a separating word. It's a word in which everybody has a view on benefit. The benefits might be different, but it at least gives you a starting point for a conversation. And that's not sleight of hand, because in the dictionary it says benefit and profit are interchangeable. It's we who've begun to use the word profit to mean something that's very specific about monetary gain and so on, or surplus. You can say the same about exit strategies. So most development projects where donors have given money, they spend their life thinking, how quickly can we get out? And we're going to talk about exit strategies. And at some point, I looked at a group of partners and said, how does it feel to be told you're going to have an exit strategy? And they said, well, it seems to make a bit of a mockery of the 3 years we spent getting to know each other. So why would you use a term like exit strategy? Even though some people might want to move on, it's quite reasonable. They might have finished, they might need to move to something else. But that terminology is the wrong terminology. So we tend to use things like moving on, which could easily mean closing, moving away, but it doesn't somehow sound as if somebody's just quitting. Another two final words are the word beneficiary and the word donor. Completely change their meaning in a partnership. So if you believe that everybody gives and everybody takes, the kind of mutuality of a partnership, then you could say that every single person at the table is a donor, because they're all committing something. At the very least, they're committing time, but they're probably committing many other resources as well. And that whatever your target audience is, so to speak, assuming that's somebody else, who may be benefiting from your partnership, as partners benefiting from the relationship, you are also beneficiaries. So this development language of donor and beneficiary, I think, goes completely out of the window, and you have to just really reinvent a different language, which is that we're all in this together, we have different roles, and we have different impacts. But we have to kind of almost unprogram even ordinary words that we've used very, very casually up till now.
Anybody else have a question? There's one there.
Thank you. Ross, thank you. That was a really interesting and valuable presentation. I'm Helen Burston, and I co-chaired, and now I lead something called the Partnership Project, which here in Ontario is a strategy for the Ontario government to have a real partnership with the not-for-profit and voluntary sector. And one of the things we've realized while we're working away at this, and it's working very well, is that the first partnership has to happen internally. Yes. It has to happen within government itself. And we all think that because we're part of one organization called government, or because we're all part of an organization that's a corporate one or a not-for-profit one, that we all think the same and we have the same interpretation of partnerships. So I'd like your thoughts on how you get intra-organizational partnerships going, first of all. And the other thing is just on the question of vocabulary. I've had many years in government, and we still tend to think of our so-called partners. We've changed the name to partners, but in fact we think of them really still as stakeholders. Yes. Stakeholders is essentially differentiating and distancing sometimes, because it reinforces the idea of a supplicant, somebody who has a stake in an issue or wants something from you as government, so that's why you're coming to them. So it's part of, I think, why we have to change not only the words, but the feelings that we bring to partnership. But I'd like your comments, too, on how we get partnerships going internally.
Totally great question. And we ran this postgraduate course in Cambridge on cross-sector partnership for about 8 years, which is not dissimilar to I've just looked at your leaflet over there about your social innovation course. And in this process, all the people on the course would have to go away and do an experimental learning partnership. And what they came back with every single year without fail, the first year I thought it was an aberration, the second year I thought it was a coincidence, the third year I started listening. And what they came back with every single time were two things. One is that cross-cultural partnering is more difficult than cross-sectoral, and that internal partnerships are more difficult than external. And I thought the cultural point was really interesting because this was a very diverse group, but they'd really found it more difficult to work with somebody from a different culture with really different values and ways of doing things than they did to work with business if they were in an NGO. Now, whether it's because they put more effort into the cross-sectoral one, because they assumed that would be the one that was difficult, or whatever it was, but it happened year after year. It happened 9 times that was a finding. And I think partnership could be the most wonderful expression of diversity. And that's why I keep emphasizing, make sure your partnerships are as diverse as possible and really ask people what they bring so that the diversity is kind of, anyway, that's the external question. The internal one, you're absolutely right, because the second thing they all came back with was, even in the Niger Delta, people working for Shell would say, well, it's a nightmare trying to make these partnerships with all these different community groups, but it's even worse trying to get our colleagues who are getting the oil out of the ground to understand what this is about. And year after year after year after year, people would come on the course saying, this is what's tearing our hair out. We can learn how to work with each other because we listen and we try, but we cannot change the internal culture. So that's why I talk about systems. And I think you have to give as much attention internally as you do externally. And I think perhaps one of the ways of doing it is to bring internal people with you to some of the partnership events so they understand what the implications are. Because it isn't business as usual with a different word. It's actually profoundly different to business as usual. And people won't really see it unless they feel it. So I think the feeling bit is quite important. So find some key people to bring along, to introduce, to take to see. I mean, that's one way of doing it. I think the other thing really is system change. So, I mean, a little example might be when you're trying to get people to move, lawyers, for instance, to try and move towards collaboration agreements rather than contracts. I mean, I can't tell you the times, even just contracts that we've been given, I spent days and days and days giving people the arguments to go to their lawyers to say, but we can't have a contract because what we're trying to inculcate is mutuality. We want a relationship over time, and we want to have something where it's ebb and flow, and sometimes we might do something, sometimes they might do something. A contract won't give us that. And slowly, 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 legal departments in the UNDP and legal departments in Microsoft, or whatever it is, are beginning to realize that those contracts don't work. And that's just beating your head against the wall, but really looking at where the blocks are in the system and then just painstakingly explaining why and why and why.
We're about to have a conversation about toolkits. Is there advice you can give on the kinds of things that need to go into a toolkit so that government can either help or get out of the way of the kinds of work these people want to do together?
I think toolkits, well, I've written about 6. So, for me, toolkits can only ever be checklists of questions. I don't think you can really advise anybody else how to do things. I think you can just almost have like a list of prompt questions. And for me, a real prompt question is, what would happen if we didn't? So it's how can I tell the story? I've been asked by media many, many times, sort of very cynical, when you're interviewed by somebody from the media and they're really cynical. No offense to media people or anything, but, they sort of say, oh, this partnership stuff, it's all a load of eyewash. And you kind of say, oh, really? And then the way I deal with it now is just say, well, what would your solution be? And they sort of say, well, not my job to have a solution. And I say, yes, but you're rubbishing this solution, so why don't you give me your solution? And nobody's ever come back with another answer. So the kind of question that says, what's, your government, you want to achieve these things, what's getting in the way? Asking them to enumerate what's getting in the way. So they have to self-advise. They have to self-understand the answer. You can't tell them. It's something they have to experience.
But what if the people who are in an NGO or a nonprofit have had an experience with government and found a frustration? Would that not be just as valuable to say, the toolkit should have this in it so we don't bump into this all the time? Yes,
I think it could. And I think the other thing, somebody mentioned before about stories. Somebody talked about the stories and didn't have time to talk about the failures. So again, we've got a tool book which is called Case Studies as Tools for Change. And the idea there is that you actually only talk about not so much the failures, but you only talk about the learning. So you can have a case study that literally says, not, aren't we clever, we did this wonderful job, but this is what it took, this is what it took, this is what went wrong, this is the argument we had to make, this is what didn't work, this is when we had somebody who changed, this is when the government changed. This, you know, so it's the kind of response to the circumstances which are conditioning the partnership's ability to proceed. And I think those kind of things are really helpful because they give people confidence that's been happened before. So I think some of those, if you produce some of those stories and you tell the stories or you take the stories to people, they'll recognize for themselves that there is a lot of them in that, inside that story.
A question here.
Thanks. I really appreciated both the presentation and the extraordinary resources that you highlighted. I appreciated both the presentation and the extraordinary and very generous of you to share some of the resources that you have. In my experience when I was talking about housing earlier when you were here, is that one of the things that seems to be a fundamental failure over and over again is that when we push things out of government, which we have, to civil society or private groups or some of the partnership models you do, we fail to align authority with responsibility. So what we do is we give people responsibility to do things, but then government, they have to come back for approvals. You know, we had a single window housing program in Canada that was quickly referred to as single window triple pane, P-A-I-N, because of the way the government managed it. The other thing is actually turning authority, aligning resources and mandate. So if you're actually going to give people toolkits to generate revenue and you turn land over to them, they have to have the final say on disposing of that. Companies and governments particularly have a great deal of difficulty, I think, actually figuring out sufficient authority because there's and you talked about shared risk and shared accountability, and that seems to be the area in which it breaks down. And I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what your advice would be to particularly government leaders about how they manage those kinds of relationships and explain them, because we don't often do that in Canada, so it becomes as new and confusing news to people, like we're giving something away to someone for free, which is the way it gets dumbed down.
Yes. I think that's a hugely important question. I'm not sure I can answer it in the few minutes that we have left, but what would I say? I think I would say, well, I have a colleague, Simon Zadek, some of you might have heard of him, a great economic thinker, the person who started an organization called Accountability. His vision of partnerships, which is different to mine, I must say, but his sense is that partnerships are driven by governance deficit. That's his starting point. So he basically says, because our systems don't work and our government is too autocratic, or, you know, whatever it is, whatever the critique is, and it might be different in different countries, we need partnerships to redress the imbalance in the kind of governance systems we have. And if I loosen that up a bit, because I think he's a little bit too rigid about that, I suppose my take on it would be to say that there is a risk with partnerships, that partnerships become an alternative system. And I think that's particularly true, perhaps not in Canada, but it's particularly true in countries where government is very weak or very corrupt. So quite often partnerships are growing up because government is unaccountable and poor and so on and so forth. And then then I've heard people speak, and I think it's quite correct, that if you do that, then the governance becomes less and less and less accountable because there's some wonderful new system taking over. So that's not what you're saying, but I think what that leads me to believe is that partnerships must reinvigorate the mainstream systems. It isn't an alternative system. It's a way of refreshing or challenging or reworking the existing systems. So I think if government feels as if it's become very unwieldy, then a partnership should somehow, many partnerships should have the ability to help people try and do things differently so that government actually changes. It is ultimately about changing the status quo for the better, which is where we started this morning. It's a mechanism for changing the status quo for the better rather than duplicating or substituting. So governments cannot be let off the hook, but they also have to be shown how much damage they do by not giving way. It's a kind of funny balance between the two.
All right, you know what? I want to thank Ross Tennyson